Hello, I'm Cedric Milton, Neighborhood Programs Manager for the Village of Oak Park. As part of our continuing segment focusing on African American history, we are pleased to present an interview with award-winning author and longtime Oak Park resident, Harriette Gillem Robinet. Mrs. Robinet has written several published books that chronicle the struggles that African Americans have faced throughout this nation's history. Nancy Garino, chair of the Oak Park Community Relations Commission, recently sat down with Mrs. Robinet to discuss her work and what motivated her to become a writer.
Before talking about your writing, I think it's important for us to know a little bit about your personal history. Where were you raised and what was that community like?
I'm from Washington, D.C., born and raised in Washington, D.C., attended school in Washington through high school. We spent our summers across the Potomac in Arlington, Virginia, where my grandparents had been slaves at Robert E. Lee's home, and on the other side of my mother's family, they had been at Mount Pelia in Virginia, where the Madisons, Dolly Madison, one of the books brings that up. And my father's people were from Baltimore, were from Maryland, St. Mary's area in Maryland, and they had been slaves in that area off of the boat in Annapolis. So we've been in America some 300 years. I have a book that gives one of our names in 1654. So we've been around in the East Coast for a long time.
What people or events influenced you most growing up?
I had wonderful parents. They believed in education and learning and service back to the community. My father taught history and geography in junior high school and also got his LLB degree, but he only practiced, he never had anyone pay him for practicing. He'd go into court with people, but he made his money off of being a junior high school teacher. And so I read people wonder what books I was reading. Kids were asking me the other day. I couldn't go to the libraries in Virginia because I was black. The library in Washington, if you went in, someone followed you and told you to keep moving and suspected I was stealing a book or something. It was very uncomfortable. And that was, I didn't get to go. My parents protected me and told me that the books would have germs and that I didn't want to have that kind of book. So I didn't go until after my father died. When I was 13, then I discovered why they were protecting me from the outrages of segregation and racism in the libraries in Washington, D.C. So my aunt got the great books. My mother thought it was outrageous to pay that much money, but she got a bookcase with green leatherette covers to Shakespeare and Dickens and all the great British novels, Silas Marner and Jane Austen novels and all. And those were what I read as a child.
You studied microbiology in undergraduate and graduate school and went on to teach biology at Xavier University and work as a research bacteriologist at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In light of all that science background, how did you ever begin writing fiction?
After I married, I had worked 10 or 11 years as a bacteriologist and maybe 12 by that time. I wanted to come home with our first child and be a housewife. That was my aim in life, to be a bored housewife, but not too bored, to have my baby and make a little bit of money on the side. So I took a correspondence course called Famous Writers. I began submitting things and getting an article into magazines from time to time. And one of the first was the Red Book article on Young Mother's Story on moving into Oak Park. I made enough money off of that article that I bought an electric typewriter. And then I was really in business. I was really thrilled to have an electric typewriter. So that's how I got into writing. It was nonfiction. I took a course in nonfiction. Then our fifth child, Jonathan Robinet, had cerebral palsy. lives here at Ryan Farley in Oak Park on Humphrey. And I went to the library. Thank God the librarians and library here was a very beautiful place, great librarians. I went to the library to find books of courage for disabled children. There were none. I just couldn't find any. And so I wrote some stories and started sending them around to publishers. And they were rejected some 18, 20, 22 times. And I got very nice letters of rejection saying that we really love these stories, but nobody wants to read about disabled children. That was the essence of it. And then a friend, Crystal Bailey, who used to be a children's librarian here in Oak Park, came by the house. And I said, "What's new in libraries and books?" And she said, "Oh, I just came from ALA, American Library Association meeting, and they have enough of rural stories, country, farm, children's stories, enough urban stories, city children. They have none about disabled kids." And I said, "They don't." And so I sent out the 2 books, and they were picked up by the first or second publisher I sent them to, after they had been going the rounds for 10 or 11 years. But now the librarians said they were interested in that style of book, so the publishers published them. And those are Ride the Red Cycle and Jay and the Marigold. So then there was another 11 years in which I was sending, they were basically picture books, sending picture books around and getting rejected. And I was reading Writing Magazine, and it said how to write historical fiction. I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. I love you can do research. I like to do research." And I said, "But what would I do?" I went to the radio, turned it on. Bob and Betty Samuels had their talk show, and they said it was the anniversary of the Great Chicago Fire, October 8th. Oh, that was 1971. And I said, "That's it. I'm going to write historical fiction for children about the Great Chicago Fire. I've got Oak Park's library to start with and the Chicago Historical Society. I've got it made."
I know that you wrote 7 other historical novels, such as Washington City is Burning, The Twins, the Pirates, and the Battle of New Orleans, 40 Acres and Maybe a Mule. How did you choose these other historical events that form the basis for these novels?
The Civil War I didn't want to touch. It's been really well done for children, but I was thinking the area after the time after the Civil War, Reconstruction, I really didn't know much about. And so I was walking through the hall and said to my son, "I don't know anything about Reconstruction. I should do some research." And he said, "You mean 40 Acres and Maybe a Mule?" And I had the title for the book immediately, and I researched it and wrote that particular book. But while I was writing that one, I came upon, of course, Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction, 4 million slaves being freed. He could not see black people and white people coexisting in America. And so he said, "We will send them off and make colonies of them in Africa and in South America." This is the era of colonization. All of Africa was divided up into British Africa and West Dutch Africa and different colonies, and so was South America, where the people weren't allowed to develop themselves in the colonies, but they were exploited. So Lincoln decided to send the blacks, and that one colony was attempted. And there would be an asterisk in all the reading about Reconstruction. There would be asterisks, and then there would be a footnote. One colony was attempted and failed, and Lincoln, abandoned this Reconstruction plan. I kept saying, "Well, what about that colony? How can we learn about it?" And so I was fascinated by it, and I began doing research, digging out. I had to go to some interesting places. Here's the book, If You Please, President Lincoln. All of the research was from the 1800s, and there was a New York Herald newspaper article, Tuesday, March 22nd, 1864. I was actually able to hold the newspaper in my hand at the Newberry Library and read the newspaper article when the slaves came back from the colony and what they were saying and all, and it was thrilling, and I was doing that. And I glanced down. One of the newspapers had been a Washington, D.C. newspaper that I was reading to see what they said about the colonists returning. And lo and behold, there was the next line in the wonderful, the file that you look for what you want to order from the Newberry Library was Washington City burning. And I said, hey, that's wonderful. What a wonderful topic for another book. So I was smart enough in the research book. I do all of my research in notebooks. In the very back, I began writing down the things that I would come and order for Washington City burning. And I got the title, 2 books, and I'm still writing 40 Acres and Maybe a Mule. So then the only battle we actually won in that War of 1812, when the British came in and burned the White House and the Congress and all in the War of 1812, the only battle we won was the Battle of New Orleans in New Orleans. So that the Twins, the Pirates, and the Battle of New Orleans, which does not glorify war, but gives a sense of the story and the time and a new aspect of slavery and of life in New Orleans.
What is the most difficult aspect of each story that you write about? Is it forming the character, the historical content, the discussion about slavery as it impacts a child, or something else?
The worst part of it is not being able to sleep at night, waking at 3 in the morning and having the story run through my mind and what I should have done and what I need to do and where it's going. And because the whole time you're writing it, and you're writing it in your mind, I find that I have the first, before I begin the first word, I have the first scene. I can see them in scenes, and then I want to cut out one scene because you show and you don't tell. You want to get the story through in dialogue and action and showing. So the worst part is being obsessed by it. That's the hardest thing. Once it's all written out, then you can sort of relax and you're improving it and rewriting it for another year. But getting it all down in the initial phase is very absorbing. I can't, I find myself crossing the street and thinking of something and having to watch both ways because my mind was saying, now wait a minute, would her personality have done that, or how would he have answered to that, or because the characters have their strengths and weaknesses, and then I let them go through the story. So that's an interesting question.
You've received several awards: the 1998 Scott Odell Award, the 1998 Midland Authors Award, the 1997 Carl Sandburg Award, and the 1991 Juvenile Literary Award from the Friends of the American Writers. Which award means the most to you?
The greatest award is children reading, and I get letters. And the letters from kids are really exciting. And some of them scold me. One told me that I had the boy in Mississippi Chariot fool the town in order to free his father from the chain gang, and that I was teaching kids to do bad things to get good reasons, good results. So it's very good to hear from them.
Thank you for your time, Mrs. Robinet.
Welcome.
Mrs. Robinet is the author of 10 published books, several of which we've discussed today. Those are Jay and the Marigold, Ride the Red Cycle, Children of the Fire, Mississippi Chariot, If You Please, President Lincoln, Washington City is Burning, The Twins, the Pirates, and the Battle of New Orleans, 40 Acres and Maybe a Mule, Walking to the Bus Rider Blues, Missing from Haymarket Square. Mrs. Robinet's books are available at the Oak Park Public Library and several local bookstores.